Alrighty everyone, hello. So today I really want to discuss a certain book with you that, if you want to know more about the theology side of Christian witchcraft, is really imperative for you to look into, and that is What Paul Really Said About Women by John Temple Bristow. This book, as you can see, I've gone through quite a bit of it. This book is a treasure. It's really short, as you can see, it's really thin, not much to it, and it's only, page-wise, yeah, it's only 119 pages, so it's a really quick read, but the information in it is just a kick to the teeth when it comes to talking about women, theology, their place in this whole story, so on and so forth. So this book made its way to me pretty unexpectedly. It was actually one of my friends on TikTok who sent me this book just like out of the blue one day. And it's funny because I would, in my prayers to God, I tell him all the time, I'm like, listen to me, Paul has until I reach him to explain himself about all of this that, we see said all the time, say in like 1 Corinthians and 1st, 2nd Timothy, and all those other places where women are supposed to be like under the husband, where they'll only be redeemed by having children, so on and so forth. All of these really misogynistic interpreted verses that have put women kind of in the back burner of their own faith for quite a while. Belok? What? The thing about this book that I love so much is that the entire focus of it is breaking down what Paul actually meant. Like, it's exactly as the title says, what Paul really said, as in, what the hell the Greek actually means, what it means in the context of which it was written down, and also how it's actually supposed to be applied to certain communities and churches that, Paul was going around to. And so to start off, I think one of the most shocking revelations within this book is the idea that actually a lot of this anti-woman ideology doesn't come from Paul. It comes from actually people just hyping up Greek philosophers way too damn hard. Because if you understand the way that early Christians came about, obviously the first Christians were, the Jewish people who were following Jesus. They didn't consider themselves Christians right away. This was a term that was actually more coined by the Roman Empire. And so at first, it was, these people were considered Jewish people. They were considered Jewish people, but they were considered apostates or heretics. And while the Romanization of this area did impact Jewish culture a little bit, and that there was a point where Jewish people were starting to, use those Greek gymnasiums and Roman facilities as part of the Roman Empire. I have pigeon feathers everywhere. What really ended up happening, though, is that as Christianity spread away from Jewish people to the Gentiles, right, as it got very clear that this is no longer something that can be called Judaism anymore because it's patently not Judaism anymore, more Gentiles started picking up, but they already had the background of this Greek education, philosophy, and so on. These people didn't convert in a vacuum. They weren't blank slates. And a lot of people hailed Greek philosophy as this pinnacle of like education, ration, all these other kinds of things, because one of the key components of being an educated person was understanding rhetoric. Rhetoric just being like how to make compelling arguments and how to make detailed, logical statements. And so we find that some of the most absolutely horrid misogynistic takes are not coming from Paul at all, but instead coming from people like Socrates, Aristotle, Zeno, all of these other, philosophers that everyone hypes up for being so smart and amazing. They're out there saying things like women should basically just cook, clean, take care of kids, and stay as silent as possible. That men should not love their wives because wives are a dime a dozen, women themselves are a dime a dozen, and all women can do is distract you from the truth and, from knowledge and wisdom and all these other things. They were actually insisting, these basically ancient incels sitting on the stoop, that women in their entirety were things not to be bothered with outside of having an heir or, whatever other social construct that was going on at the time. So when Paul says men love your wives, ironically, that is actually a pretty radical take for the time. But right away, I thought I was going to read this book and I thought I was going to be less mad, and reading that part first only made me like twice as mad. I took all the rage I had towards Paul, doubled it, and redirected it towards Greek philosophers. And it's knowing that helps us understand what was going on with Paul's letters, because actually, and he, Bristow breaks down verse by verse the Greek and what was actually meant, and like the way the verbs are used, the different forms, the different cases of the nouns that he's using. He breaks it all down to show that actually a lot of the things people think Paul was saying were the complete opposite, but because people continued with their highfalutin education to interpret Paul through the lens of these philosophers, everything got lost in translation. Everything. For instance, when the verse says that, men are the head of the wives, that doesn't mean like the boss. In fact, the language Paul is using, according to Bristow, is more language that insists on, say, an army formation. Instead of using something like arch, which would, like archbishop, anything else, that would actually assume that someone is the leader, the head, the boss. There's an entirely different word used that's suggesting that men are actually not so much the head is in the boss, but the head is in the front lines, right? So Paul is saying that men go ahead of your wives, basically. Go ahead of them, take on the risk, take on the danger. Women, support your husbands in this battle, right? That's how army formations would work. One flank goes out first, the others come back up to support them when they start getting attacked. That's more the metaphor Paul is using. Likewise, when Paul is saying women be silent in church, he's not saying that women should never speak, because obviously in the Bible itself, and I believe Paul even acknowledges this, it's said that both men and women will prophesy. And so Paul is saying, basically, wait your turn to speak. In that whole context, he's saying, wait your turn to speak, be silent while other people are talking. And what's really cool is that Bristow pulls in a modern example, a really modern day version, which is so mind-blowingly insightful and crazy. In essence, right, in these ancient societies, women did not have access to education the way that men did. Women did not go to schools. They didn't go to public places to learn like that. And so they didn't have what we might now call classroom etiquette. You know what I'm saying? And so Bristow brings in a modern version where I guess there was some missionary work going on in a certain very rural province in China, which had much the same situation going on. The women really didn't have access to education. They weren't really supposed to go to school like the men were. And so when it came time for everyone to come together and learn about the Bible and everything like that, what happened was these women who usually don't see each other that often, and who are mostly stuck at home doing a lot of the domestic work, they had a fresh and honestly very rare chance to see each other and to catch up on the gossip, to reconnect with friends they hadn't seen in a while, to be out in public space and do what they wanted. So what happened was there was a lot of side conversations and a lot of distraction and a lot of just kind of general social gathering happening while people were trying to talk and preach up at the front of the gathering. And so someone that was there said, oh, it's just like Corinthians, it's just like Corinth. Basically, as in that verse that Paul is saying where it's women be silent, it was a similar situation happening then, in which these women who were confined to the home really were looked down on if they were walking around outside the home, especially without a man. They were now in this place where not only was it already really risque for men and women to be in the same place publicly outside of temple prostitutes for Aphrodite and the men that would get their services, but also it was a completely different social situation in which women didn't have the same etiquette because they hadn't been exposed to the same educational structure. So Paul is saying, hey, hold your peace. Literally, that verb is hold your peace, be peaceful, and wait your turn to speak. He's not saying for women to never, ever, ever speak at all. And this goes into, honestly, another, that's only a couple examples. This goes into so many really crazy and important topics, right? It does tackle Timothy, and even though that Bristow acknowledges that most scholars come to a consensus that Timothy actually wasn't written by Paul, but was forged in his name, which can explain a lot of the crazy backtracking on these values that happens in Timothy, he does still treat it as if it was written by Paul and explains the verbiage going on there, and also points out that the times that Paul says stuff that completely contradicts what's going on in Timothy too. When people are saying, oh, women are only redeemed by having kids because original sin, blah blah, Paul hits back in his own works, because obviously he wasn't really on the same stuff, whatever this forged writer was. He outright says to people who have this mindset, well, you know, all men come out of women, and therefore for you to just kind of disregard women makes you all very silly. Very interesting concept. But in here, it's really organized very well. We have Paul's message about women's attire, right, with the head coverings. There's even questions for thought and discussion, which is really cool. So, like, you know, if you have a group, if you manage to all get a hands on a copy of this, this is something really good for, like, an actual book study group where you can kind of just talk about it together after the end of a chapter. So, tons and tons of questions in here, but, you know, it covers, is celibacy holy, right? And all these other kinds of issues that we all know that Paul seemed to, like, not like cooties, so having this kind of laid out like that, fantastic. And this, like, I had already kind of started to warm up to Paul a little bit after my own study and interactions with him, but this book, again, took my anger away from Paul, doubled it, and cast it on to all the other people who were willing, going out of their way, to misinterpret Paul for the sake of their own beliefs and agendas, like Thomas Aquinas, like St. Augustine, like all these other people who were like, well, yeah, I mean, we're all equal, but women still should be below the men. Like, they have this mindset that just shows such a dissonance, because Christianity, as much as we might in the modern era look at it and say, oh, it's a little archaic, it actually wasn't at all. It was very simple and it was very clear. Men and women are equal. Jews and Gentiles are equal. Everyone's equal. And with this message, a lot of people who were very comfy, they tried to get with Christianity for the sake of salvation and rightness and goodness and God, but still couldn't get past that radical notion. And they still took a lot of that shitty baggage, that sexist baggage, with them into the new era. So absolutely grab a copy of this book if you haven't already. This is a really good read. Super quick, super short, but my god, in the 120 pages that holds this information, it just puts you in a chokehold. It's very good. So absolutely check it out, and I hope this is a helpful kind of introduction to it if you decide to do that. Have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you next time.